So go to Ruth chapter 1. We're going to begin by reading verses 1 through 5. It says this, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her sons and her husband." Now, last week we began the study in the book of Ruth. And every time that we begin a new study in this church, we like to take a Sunday, take a sermon, and try to familiarize ourselves with the book itself. And so last week we dusted off the pages of Ruth, and we set the tone for our study with an introduction sermon. And so what we looked at last week in particular was the author and the date and the occasion for the writing of the book of Ruth. And though we saw that both the author and the date were inconclusive, we did see that the purpose for the writing, the purpose for the book of Ruth, was twofold for sure. One, it was to encourage the people who would read it about the work of God in the midst of the broken situation that Israel found themselves in the book of Judges. But we also noted that because of the way in which David is referenced at the end of the book of Ruth, that it was most likely part of the purpose was to establish David in his kingship and in his line. And so that was the occasion of the writing. That is informative for us as we begin to study the book of Ruth. Because all that is happening in this book, all that we'll see at the beginning of the story and all that we see in the middle of the story is bending towards at least those 2 truths. That God is good, no matter what the circumstance. That he is in control. And that David is God's king. And that God's kingship will continue. But we also not only looked at the author, the date, and the occasion, but we also spent some time, not very much, we just talked briefly about the setting and the themes that we'll find in the book of Ruth. The settings, we talked just briefly, but that was because we needed some time. We were going to take some time this week and even going into next week to develop the setting of Ruth. Because the writer, most likely Samuel, as we talked about last week, he takes a long time in the beginning verses of Ruth to set the stage. There's a lot of information that he gives in the first couple of verses that are meant to paint the picture for us as we begin to read the book of Ruth. And so we just briefly introduced the settings last week. This week we're going to dive in a little bit more into those settings, because anytime that you study any book of the Bible, there are a couple important things to keep in mind. The first one is the character of God that is displayed in the book. We always want to seek to see what we can find about God in the book that we're reading or the book that we're studying. What is it? What type of characteristics about God are on display in this book? Though Ruth doesn't specifically mention God very often, his fingerprints are all over this book. And so we are, as we begin to study this book of Ruth, going to be pausing to behold him and to see his characteristics as we approached them. But the second thing that's very important when you study any book of the Bible is that you familiarize yourself with the setting, as we've said, as well as the context of any passage in Scripture. Both the setting and the context give for us and frame for us a picture that helps us truly understand what's going on. If we don't know what Elimelech and his family are dealing with, we won't understand why they made the decisions that they did. If we don't understand some of the picture of what it's like to be a widow in that time, we won't understand why Naomi acts as she does. Or why it seems hopeless at times for Ruth. We have to understand the setting and the context in order to truly have a right interpretation and understanding of the text. And so part of our job today then is to connect the setting that we began talking about last week with the beginning of the narrative that we're going to begin today. So the story starts today, but how does the setting help us understand the beginning of this story? So before, though, we begin to look at the setting, I do have a question that I want you guys all to consider today. The question is this: what part of the setting that we know already, right? What part of the setting of the book of Ruth do you find most compelling, and why? Take a few minutes to talk about this in your homes. And the question again is, what part of the setting of the book of Ruth do you find most compelling, and why? Take a few moments to talk about it. I hope you had enough time to talk about it with each of the people that were watching with you. But I think it's a fascinating study to look at the setting in depth for the book of Ruth. We took just a little bit of time last week to do this. We mentioned verse 1, that it was that the setting of the book of Ruth is in the days when the judges ruled. And what we said about the judges last week is that was a trying time for the people of Israel. A time where there was no leadership, and a time when there was iniquity was allowed and kind of permeated the people of Israel. It was a time of disconnection between the tribes. It was a time when people of Bethlehem didn't know much about what people in Jerusalem were doing. There was no cohesion among the people of Israel. And then we talked a little bit about the book of Judges. We specifically talked about how the book of Judges shows deeply the distress that Israel was in. Because it's interesting to note that in the 21 chapters of the book of Judges, there is a progression that happens. And the progression is a downward spiral towards depravity. A downward spiral away from God. So much so that the final chapters, specifically chapters 17 to 21 of the book of Judges, none of them have a redeemer that is specifically added to redeem or to take back, to deliver the people of Israel. Instead, those passages, those chapters are meant to just show us just how depraved the people of Israel have become. So what I'd like to do just for a few moments as we begin is to look a little bit more in depth into the time when the judges ruled, and how that may have affected Elimelech and his family and the choices that they've made. And so let's take just a few moments here. The usual sequence that you will see in the book of Judges is this: Israel will sin against God, rebel against God. And the people will choose, as we said last week, to do what looks good or what looks and seems right in their own eyes. This began at the very beginning of the book of Judges with a choice that the people of Israel made to disregard God's wisdom, as he said, to push all people that were not Israel, out of the promised land. In the conquest of Canaan, to make sure that all people who were not part of Israel were removed from the land. That was God's wisdom, and they chose to reject it, and instead decided to live amongst some, especially the least dangerous of those tribes that were living in Canaan. And so it began there. Israel sinned against God, rejecting his wisdom and choosing, instead of to completely conquer the land, to allow some of the peoples to stay. And then the second part of this sequence is that when Israel sins against their God, God comes to them with judgment. God's judgment can take several different forms in the book of Judges. Oftentimes it's through their enemies, but sometimes it's through natural disasters. And other times it's more localized judgment on a person. But the fact of the matter is that this is the sequence. Israel sins against God. God responds in judgment. So Israel has nothing left to do but to repent. So Israel repents, cries out to God. And then God sends his deliverer. We talked about this just briefly last week. But I want to read for you a passage from Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 20, that displays this sequence. It says this, Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 20. It says this: "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples, who were around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress." Then verse 16. "Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judge, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning, because of those who had afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against them. This is the pattern during this time of the judges. Reject God, receive judgment, cry out to God, receive a deliverer, rinse and repeat. Each time that the judge would die, the next generation was worse than the one before it. And so time and time again, this sequence rolled over. It repeated. The people of Israel would sin. God would judge them. They would cry out to God. God would deliver them. They would sin again. God would judge them. They would cry out to God. He would deliver them. Time and time again. The people of Israel, stubborn in their ways, would turn away from God, only to be delivered by His grace again. And so I have another question for you that I want you to take a few moments to think about and to talk about again. This one is two questions, all in context of the downward spiral of the people of Israel that we see in the book of Judges. And these are the questions. Why does sin become so strong when God is distant? And the second question is, what does God do for sinners who cry out to Him? Take a few minutes at home and talk about these questions. Again, why does sin become so strong when God is distant? And what does God do for the sinners who cry out to Him? Take a few minutes to talk about it. The question that we're trying to answer here is, why does sin seem so strong when God is distant, or when God is kept at an arm's length? Why does sin seem so strong? And ultimately, it's because inside of man, without God, is a heart that is prone to sin, is a heart that is infused by a sinful nature. And it's a heart that longs to do as it pleases. And when that happens, sin is what is produced. When the heart is allowed to be free to work, sin is what is produced. And so sin seems so strong when God is held at a distance, because the only overcoming power for sin is God. So this is why in the book of Judges, as Israel was rejecting their God, they got into this downward spiral of depravity. I want to paint this picture in another way, just really quickly. I want to talk about a few stories here that we find in the book of Judges. There's 3 of them that I want to bring to our attention, 2 of them right away, and then one kind of nearing the end of our time. But the first one is this. It's Othniel's story. It's found in Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. I want you to just pay particular attention to how God works in the midst of the brokenness and in the midst of the sin of his people. This is Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. It says this, "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asheroth. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the land of Cushan Rishmathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan Rishtathaim for 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel, who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan Rishtathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand. And his hand prevailed over Cushan Rishtathaim. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died." What we see here in this story is that the people of God had rejected God. The people of Israel had rejected their God and pushed him away and done what was evil in his sight. And so he sent them off into slavery to serve the people of Mesopotamia, especially their king. And he judged them, brought about judgment upon them for their sin and their wickedness. And yet after 8 years, the people of God cried out to him. God had compassion. God loved them. And he sent Caleb's nephew, Othniel. He sent him to go and win a battle for Israel so that Israel could be saved. What we see here is that God, in the midst of that broken and sinful generation, watching the wickedness of his people, responds in judgment. Yet his love for them gives him compassion on them, so that when they cry out to him, he sends a judge, Othniel. A couple things to note here is that Othniel, right now, what we know of him by this passage and this passage alone, is that he seems to be an upright man who falls in line with some of the great people in Israel, Caleb being one of them. And so righteousness probably was something that defined him. He was known in Israel, and his at least his story, his character seems to be pretty squeaky clean at this point. There's nothing bad to say about him before he becomes judge. But that will not always be the case in the book of Judges. Think about Samson in the end. The one who was set apart by his family to be holy, yet chooses time and time again to do that which is unholy. Whether it be touching something that was dead, or partaking in drink that he was not supposed to, or cutting his hair, or marrying a Philistine. All these things he does in spite of the calling of God that had been placed on his life. But that's not Othniel. Othniel, there's nothing bad to say about him. And so it's interesting to watch as even the judges that are being chosen by God will begin to show more flaws as we move on in the book of Judges. But the second story in the book of Judges is about a different judge. We find it in Judges chapter 10, verses 6 through 9. It's Jephthah. The judge is Jephthah. And in these verses, we're going to see a similar story, but something that I want to point out in it. It says this in verses 6 through 9, and then we'll also read in chapter 11, 29 through 31. But it says this, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth and the gods of Syria and the gods of Sidon and the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites and the gods of the Philistines. And they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the Ammonites. And they crushed and oppressed the people of Israel that year. For 18 years, they oppressed all the people of Israel who were beyond the Jordan in the land of the Amorites, which is in Gilead. And the Ammonites crossed the Jordan to fight also with Judah and against Benjamin and against the house of Ephraim, so that Israel was severely distressed. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, we have sinned against you, because we have forsaken our God and served the Baals. And the Lord said to the people of Israel, did I not save you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites and from the Ammonites and from the Philistines, the Sidonians also, and the Amalekites and the Moabites oppressed you? And you cried out to me, and I saved you out of their hand. Yet you have forsaken me and served other gods. Therefore I will save you no more. Go and cry out to the gods whom you have chosen. Let them save you in the time of your distress. And the people of Israel said to the Lord, we have sinned. We have sinned. Do to us whatever seems good to you. Only please deliver us this day. So they put away their foreign gods from among them and served the Lord. And he became impatient over the misery of Israel. Here we see God, as Israel continues to spiral into depravity. We see that he is fed up with this cycle with the people of Israel, saying, you have chosen other gods. Go and ask them to save you. Yet the people of Israel know that there is no other God that can save them. That those gods of the other peoples, even the gods of the Moabites, who we'll find, we're going to see a little bit in the settings today, that those gods cannot save them. Those gods are impotent in their power. They have no power to help the people of Israel. So the people of Israel, they put away their foreign gods. Choose God and God alone in that moment. But then we pick up the story in chapter 11, verses 29 through 31. It says, then the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and passed on to Mizpah of Gilead. And from Mizpah of Gilead he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow before the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the door of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's. And I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So what ends up happening in this story is that Jephthah goes to fight the Ammonites. And he has the Spirit of the Lord with him. He is the judge whom God has raised up to deliver the people of Israel. And he is successful in that campaign, delivering the people of Israel from their oppressors. And yet, as you can see, because of the spiraling towards this depravity, the judge did not just trust that God was with him, but he made a deal with the Lord. And he tried to make this deal to say, God, if you bring the Ammonites into my hands, I will give you whatever comes to greet me when I return home. I will sacrifice them to you. Well, you may know the story. But in the victory march home, the first thing that comes to meet Jephthah happens to be a beloved daughter of his, a beloved child. And just to show how ugly the time was and the distress of the people of Israel, Jephthah sacrifices that beloved member of his family. So God had delivered them, but it cost a price this time. because of the wickedness of the people of Israel. But that's not all that we need to kind of consider from the book of Judges. We should see in the book of Judges this distancing from God, but also this spiral into depravity and this distress that seems to be mounting and building for the people of Israel. But in terms of the setting for the book of Ruth, there's another thing that we need to consider. What was happening in the area where Elimelech and his family was from? During the time of the Judges, Bethlehem, as we talked about last week, is the hometown of Elimelech and Naomi. And during the time of the Judges, Bethlehem was not left alone. They were not in some way protected from the distress of the time of the Judges. In fact, they show up in a couple of the stories of the times of the Judges. I said and mentioned that the last 5 chapters of Judges seem to be not within the sequence of sin, judgment, cry out, deliverer, but instead just seem to show just how ugly the time of the Judges has become. And just how much iniquity there was in this time. Well, there's a final story that matters for Bethlehem in particular, that really shows the distress of the time of the Judges. It's found in Judges 19, verses 1 through 3. It says this, it says, "In those days when there was no king in Israel," keep that in mind. There was no king in Israel. "A certain Levite was sojourning in remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim." Remember, Elimelech, who we're going to meet in just a moment, is an Ephrathite. So in the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah. And was there some 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and to bring her back. This story that involves the city of Bethlehem shows just how distressful this time was and how wicked and brutal the time of the Judges were. Because as this man goes to speak to his wife and to speak kindly to her to bring her back, he visits with his father-in-law. And in that time, some wickedness happens in Bethlehem. To the point where men begin to riot outside the father-in-law's home, wanting to take captive the Ephrathite who had come down the mountain to Bethlehem and to do unknown and untold things to him. And then the father-in-law, trying to be righteous and protect his son-in-law who had come down from the hills, offers his daughters and his ultimately this man's concubine to the crowd. And the story ends that in distress and in pain, this man from the hill country of Ephraim takes back his dead wife or dead concubine. And eventually feels the need to show the depravity and the wickedness that has overcome the tribes of Israel by sending a piece of her to each and every tribe of the people of Israel. That is how distressful and broken this time was. And how wicked the time of the Judges became. And how sin was willing and was allowed to reign amongst the people of Israel. They had spiraled down. They had spiraled away from their God into depravity. And it is so hard to read stories like that. But this is the setting that we find Elimelech and his family in. This is the type of things that were going on outside of their home. And what we do in the book of Ruth is we get a small picture of what it was like for one family who lived in a remote area during the time of the judges. What were they dealing with? Where were they going? And so we find and we meet Elimelech here in the first 2 verses of Ruth. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And the man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, and he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. So what we first encounter here in terms of the story for the book of Ruth is that the time of the judges was distressful for this family. The time of the judges was hard on them. And not only on top of the wickedness of the people of Israel, there was a famine in the land. And that famine was forcing the hand of Elimelech to make a decision and a choice. But before we get to his choice, I want to just talk about this family. This family of Elimelech had settled in the city of Bethlehem of Judah. They were Ephrathites, so that means that their people were from the same area as the Ephrathite who had come down to Bethlehem to find his wife. They were from that same area, but they had settled in the land or in the city of Bethlehem. He's also living there, being a Bethlehemite. And his name is Elimelech. His name means that God is king. That's the meaning of his name. And so every time that anybody said his name, they knew and were declaring that God is king. This is so interesting in a time when Israel had no king, that the first character that is mentioned in the book of Ruth is a man whose very name declares that God is king. This is a name then that brings encouragement to the people of God, and maybe even a challenge for them to follow the God who is their king. His name was both an encouragement, I think, because of the brokenness of the time and because of the lack of leadership that Israel had. Elimelech tells the people that God is still on the throne, that God is king. But he was a Bethlehemite living in Bethlehem. He was also most likely a farmer, because everybody living in Bethlehem at the time was a farmer. It was just a matter of whether or not you had a lot of land or a small amount of land. But you were a farmer. And if you had a lot of land, you had many servants who were going through the land to collect the harvest for you. If you had a small amount of land, you did it on your own with your family. But the fact is that he owned land, which we'll find out later, because as the story ends, there's a purchasing of the land of Elimelech. But he was a farmer, which means that the famine was particularly hard on him and on his family. A famine usually is brought about by a drought of some kind or by some sort of brokenness in the cycle of the crops. There could be a storm that had come through and destroyed a whole bunch. There could be a bugs that had come through and eaten up the crops, but most likely it was having to do with the drought. The famine made it so that there was no produce, nothing to be harvested, or very little to be harvested, making it so that there's very little to eat. And a man who has a family, a husband and a father like Elimelech, he has a responsibility to that family to care for them. And so right now, his harvest, his farm, his land is not producing enough to care for his family. That's what he's experiencing in this moment. The distress of the judges, no leadership in Israel, no nationalism in Israel, but instead a feeling of being alone, most likely. And then a famine makes it so his land is not producing enough for his family. He has a choice that he will be confronted with. He has a choice that he's going to have to take on. It's coming in a few moments. But as a farmer in the land of Bethlehem, normally you had crops that were in abundance in Bethlehem. In fact, Bethlehem itself means bread or means basket of bread. In fact, it had a idea within the people of Israel. It was called the bread basket of Israel. And so there's an irony here. That in spite of the fact that Bethlehem was known for its produce and known for its crops and known for its bread, Elimelech is not experiencing the blessing of that land. But instead he's experiencing the famine of the land. But Elimelech is not only a farmer, he's also a husband to a lady named Naomi. Naomi will eventually be one of the main characters as we continue in this book. But Elimelech was her husband. And Naomi, her name, means pleasant. Means happy state. Means pleasant. She is referencing, or at least I think helping us to understand as we look at her name, that if God is king, Elimelech, then we'll be in a happy state or a pleasant state. It's part of what I think is being communicated there. But Naomi goes with her husband as her husband makes the choice that we're alluding to. She's willing to follow him. And she's willing to do the things that are hard and seemingly to take on whatever it is that the circumstances of life will throw at her. She follows Elimelech wherever he will lead. But not only is he a husband to Naomi, but he's also a father. A father to Mahlon and Chilion, 2 boys. We don't know if they had any other children. We don't know if they had any servants of any kind. But we do know that they had 2 boys. And both of those boys they were very proud of and seemed to have loved them very much. But Mahlon and Chilion both have meanings to their names as well. They're going to be more important to us next week than they are this week, but their meanings are sickness. Mahlon means like sickness or weakness. And Chilion means kind of consumption or the taking of. And so there's a play on these names that is happening in this story that we'll get to in a few moments. But again, Elimelech is forced to make a decision because of the famine that has hit the area that Bethlehem remains. And so this famine and the effects of the famine are causing Elimelech to have to figure out how he can care for his family, how he can keep them alive during this time of distress. Now, one thing that's interesting to note, especially in the context of the judges when we look at Ruth, is that God has told his people time and time again that if you choose to walk away from me, I will judge you. If you choose to reject me, you will receive judgment. Well, in Leviticus chapter 26, verses 18 through 20, one of the judgments that God can and tells his people he will bring about when they reject him is famine. Read it here with me. Leviticus chapter 26, verses 18 through 20. It says, "And if in spite of this you will not listen to me, then I will discipline you again 7-fold for your sins. And I will break the pride of your power And I will make your heavens like iron and your earth like bronze. And your strength shall be spent in vain, and your land shall not yield its increase, and the trees of the land shall not yield their fruit. One of the ways in which God will judge his people is through famine and through natural disasters of that kind. And so most likely, what is being experienced by Elimelech and his family is a judgment of God from the very distress and disastrous situation that the people of Israel found themselves in. The wickedness of the time of the judges was causing for Elimelech the judgment of God in his area. And so he was forced then to make a decision. Do I stay in Bethlehem and weather the disastrous famine and weather this storm that God is bringing on us in judgment? Or do we seek to find produce and bread and food in another place? Think for a moment if you were in his shoes. Put yourself in Elimelech's place. Try to understand what he's going through. His family is feeling the distress of the time of the judges. And the judgment of God is upon them. And he has to make a decision of how he will care for his family. What would you choose? What would you do? I know for me, in fact, I was just talking with my wife about this yesterday. If somehow the funds run low, and if somehow the times become distressed, there's a distress in our family, and somehow we are in need of something to take care of us, what would I do? I told her I would do anything to protect and care for my family. 3, 4, 5 jobs, doesn't matter. I would do anything to make sure that they are cared for. That's what Elimelech is experiencing right now. He's in the midst of that worst case scenario for his family. And he has to decide what he's going to do to protect them and to care for them. Now, the question behind his choice that we need to consider today, and the question behind all of our choices that we should always consider, is which choice would be most faithful in the eyes of God? Elimelech is faced with this choice. Stay in Bethlehem and weather the storm of God's judgment. Stay in the promised land in spite of the famine. Or move. Go to another place. Ultimately, Elimelech chooses what he deems is right in his own eyes. And we're not given the judgment or what God thinks about Elimelech's decision. But he chooses to leave Bethlehem and do what seems to be right in his own eyes. What seems to be right to him is to leave and go to the area or the country, the nation of Moab. If you know anything about Moab, we've talked a little bit about it last week. But Moab was not kind to the people of Israel. Moab was not a place that was friendly for somebody like Elimelech and his family. Yet he did know that there was no famine in that land. That there was food there. That was the hope when they decided to leave and go to the area of Moab. And so, trying to do what he felt like was best for his family, he moved them there. Now the judges as we talked about already in the book of Judges. Moab comes up a couple of times. Moab has already was spoken of when we looked at Judges chapter 10 and 11. Moab was spoken of as a place that offered other gods to the people of Israel, and a place where the people of Israel actually had chosen to follow those gods for a time. And so it wasn't a place that would have been high on God's list in terms of places to go, but we're not given his thoughts on Elimelech's choice, not in particular. But there's one passage that I want to show you from Judges chapter 3, a story. This judge, the judge we find in Judges chapter 3, is Ehud. Ehud was the judge. And this is what it says, starting in verse 12 through 15. It says this, "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites and went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms. And the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, for 18 years. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. And the people of Israel sent tribute by him to King Eglon. And the story continues where it's a little bit longer, but I want to just kind of briefly finish it for you. But the story continues where this left-handed man sneaks in a knife before the king and eventually stabs the king, killing him in order to deliver and release the people of Israel. And it works. They are delivered. But you can see from this story that the people of Israel did not have a good view of the people of Moab. In fact, from the very beginnings of the people of Moab until the time of Ruth and Elimelech and Naomi, all the way on into the future, Moab was considered to be a place of sin and iniquity that had begun in sin and iniquity, because they can trace their lineage to Lot and one of his daughters in that distressful time for Lot at the end as he left his home behind and his wife behind. But you can see that this was not a place that would have been the first choice for an Israelite. This was not a place that would have been looked at as a good decision by anybody in Israel. And Elimelech probably very much struggled on what he would do. But he found that the only place he could take his family, or what he thought would be the only place that he and his family could survive, was in the land of Moab. So they went. But what we see in this story, what we'll see as we continue in the narrative, is that Elimelech's choices have consequences. Elimelech's choice to move his family from Bethlehem to the land of Moab ultimately has consequences for him. And we'll see those consequences in future sermons as we study the next parts of the narrative. But his actions have consequences. And ultimately, the time of the judges, which is the setting for the book of Ruth, is a time where actions and decisions and choices had immediate consequences in terms of the relationship with God. This setting that we see, this frames for us, hopefully, what the people of Elimelech and the people of Israel were dealing with as they made these decisions. They were fearful of what might happen. They were fearful that things could go wrong and that their decision before God could be viewed as sinful, that they might receive judgment. But ultimately, they also knew that God was a God who loved them and would bring a deliverer if they would cry out to him. So there's a couple lessons here. The first one is this very lesson that we just mentioned that Elimelech will be learning soon, at least Elimelech's family will be learning. That not only did the actions in the time of the judges or the choices in the time of the judges have consequences, but so do ours. Our choices, our decisions, our actions also have consequences. They may not be immediate in terms of physical judgment as they were in the time of the judges, but they still have consequences. And God will hold us accountable for those actions and choices and decisions. In fact, we are told that we will be held accountable for every stray word that we speak. This is why we also, as people this side of the cross, holding the book of God in our hands, we had need of a deliverer. Just in the same way that the people in the time of the judges would sin against God and would receive their immediate consequence and were in need of a deliverer, we too, because of our choices and our actions, were in need of a deliverer. God, consistent to who He is, sent His Son Jesus as a deliverer for us. So it's important to note the setting, and that there is no new things under the sun, that we too have consequences for our choices, and we too are in need of a deliverer. But praise be to God that He sent His Son Jesus to die on the cross on our behalf, that we might be restored and redeemed. Praise God for that. The last thing, the last lesson that we can learn from this passage and from the choices here that Elimelech was forced to make, is that no matter what the distress is that we find ourselves in, no matter what place before God or before others, circumstances that we find ourselves in, that God is still there, that He is still King, as Elimelech's name tells us, that He is still King. And no matter what the circumstances, no matter what brokenness, no matter what falling away we experience, God is still God. God is still King. God is still consistent with who He is. And God is still gracious and good. That every time that we cry out to Him, or that a new person will cry out to Him, He will answer with His deliverer. So let us worship today. And let us rejoice in the truth of this character of God, that He is a redeeming, delivering God, no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in. Next week, we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to see some of the consequences of Elimelech's decision. And we're going to be reading specifically about the further distress that Elimelech's family goes through. In the meantime, continue to read the book of Ruth. Familiarize yourself with the book of Ruth. I challenged you last week to read it once a week as we approach each Sunday. It only takes about 10 minutes to read through, so don't neglect it. You will benefit from it if you commit to reading through it. But also follow along as we're posting devotionals as well. week after week, both on Facebook and on Instagram. So check those out and follow along with us as we study. But let's go to the Lord now in prayer. Let's ask him to remind us of his greatness, his power, and especially his love.